I read about a town that I'd never heard before. And I'm one of those people who likes to find out about the things around the story. And Mother's Day is difficult sometimes. How many of you know there's only a few mothers in the Bible? And how many times do you hear the same story? Or how many times does it go to the book of Proverbs? But this story took me, and in researching this town, I found out that it's about 8 miles, and of course, I looked on Google Maps and they put it in kilometers because it's in Europe. So then I had to do my conversion. It's about 8 miles away from Nazareth. But in Luke 7, it doesn't start in this town. It starts in the town of Capernaum. And Jesus is going down the road, and a Roman centurion who is in charge of the area comes to Jesus and says, "Heal my daughter." I'm sorry, nope, heal my servant. And Jesus says, "Take me to him." And the centurion says, "No, you can't come in my house. If you just speak it, it'll happen." And Jesus speaks it, and it happens. And Jesus says, here's a centurion with more faith than the people of Israel. That's in Capernaum. That's the first 9 verses, and I gave it to you in a nutshell because we're actually going to start at verse 11. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother. Now, one of the things I want you to see on this is this. I also checked out how far it was from Capernaum to Nain. It's about 30 miles. Now, that's basically how far it is from where we're standing to Clinton, New Jersey. Okay, I'm trying to give you some reference because Jesus was walking. You don't walk 30 miles in a half hour. You can drive there pretty easily. Luke tends to do things in very fast order. Okay, I tell people he's kind of the Sesame Street of the Bible. You know, Sesame Street in its beginning, it would do 30 seconds here, 30 seconds here, 30 seconds, 30 seconds of math, 30 seconds of English, 30 seconds of history, then more math. It was boom, 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 and it was all fast-paced. This took time. It says that Jesus was traveling with a crowd, a large crowd. That takes time. Now, I also want you to know that it's only 8 miles to Nazareth. How many of you know what significance Nazareth has? Where was that? Jesus' hometown. Most people didn't stray too far from their hometown. So guess who probably was there? Mom? His mom, Mary. So Jesus is traveling from Capernaum up here down to Nain, and then I looked up to see how long it would take to walk. And from Nain to Nazareth, there's no straight way. It's a huge mountain. You have to go around it. So Jesus was probably going the most direct way to get to Nazareth. And he had to go through Nain. And as he's there, he runs into this funeral procession. They didn't use horses and they didn't use hearses. You know, it wasn't the long 5-mile long procession that you had to wait while they all flashed their lights and kept going through the red lights. It was the only son of a mother. It was the only son. But it goes a little farther. It says, as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. The only son of his mother. And she was a widow. Her husband had already died. She was taking care of her son. and her son dies. Now, I want you to recognize the ramifications of this. There's more to it than what we think today. This, so far, the story is extremely tragic. But it's even worse. Because, as a widow, she had no income. Job opportunities were limited. It's not like today where women and men can get jobs relatively equally. And I know you can say there's differences, I get it. But what I'm saying is, a woman can go out and get a job almost as easily as a man. In that day, there were only a couple of jobs available for women. And most of them were illegal or immoral. And this woman is looking at a bleak future. Her husband has died, and her son helped out. Now her son has died. She not only has to deal with losing her loved ones, but the economic problem, the social problem, because now she basically has to go on the dole. She basically has to rely on the kindness of strangers. And a large crowd from the town was with her. She had friends. Her son had friends. They were supporting her as best they could. But how long does that last? Not going to be the rest of her life. But her loss is going to be there for the rest of her life. Verse 13. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. When the Lord saw her in the midst of all this death, Jesus' heart broke. Was he thinking about his mama? Maybe. Was he looking across time and seeing the face of his mom while he's on the cross? Maybe. I wasn't there. I can't tell you that. I know he's all God. And I know that he knows all that happens. But he reached out to her and he said something that sounds odd. His heart went out to her and he said to her, "Don't cry. Don't cry." Now you can take "don't cry" in a whole lot of different ways if you think about it. It can be empathetic. I get it, but it'll get better. Don't cry. It can be self-embarrassing. Don't cry. It can be get over it. Don't cry. I've used all of them at times. My grandchildren cry for no reason sometimes. I look at them, it won't work. Don't cry. You're not going to get your way just because you turn on the crocodile killer. But this woman is in agony, and Jesus says, "Don't cry." He's a stranger to her. By the way, just so you know, Israel isn't a huge country, but he wouldn't have known everybody in the country. Chances are he'd never met her before. Then he did something even more outrageous for the day. Then he went up and touched the bier. Basically, he touched the casket. We don't have biers today, we have caskets. Basically, the bier, they would wrap him up in cloth, and then they would have a thing that looked like a large stretcher, and people would carry it. And typically, they carried it on their shoulders because they didn't want to actually touch the dead, because then they were unclean and couldn't go to church. Jesus walks right up and touches it. Boy, did that raise some church eyebrows. You can't go to church now. You're dirty. You're unclean. Jesus didn't care. Jesus touched the bier that they were carrying him on, and the bearer stopped and stood still. Nobody does this. The procession has to go on. The formality has to go on. Did a funeral a couple years ago. And the cemetery actually said, you have X amount of time to be here. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we close at X time. And if you're not done, they don't get put in the ground until tomorrow. I said, what? They said, if the funeral goes long, if there's too many spectators, if any of this happens, we don't care. We're done at X time. I've never heard of that. There were a lot more people who visited that calling hours than I was used to. And I had to keep looking at my watch going, okay, what can I cut? I don't do a long service, but we're not going to get there in time. And they were serious. At 5 of the time designated, I was finishing up, and the groundspeople were all standing there. They actually tapped their watch for me. Sounds like a situation similar. We got to keep going, but they stop. Jesus is holding on. The carriers are stopped. Jesus grabs on and says, young man. See, that's important too. We don't know how old he was, but he was a young man. Probably between the age of 12 and 30. Because at 30 you became a real man in the culture. Okay? Young man, I say to you, get up. Get up. The dead man sat up and began to talk. The dead man sat up and began to talk of all things. Be interesting to see what his first words were. Unwrap me. Put a hole here so I can breathe. Mom, it's okay. I didn't hear that one.
Going to Disney World.
We're going to Disney World. Yeah. This is the biggest win we could ever have. It says, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Jesus gave him back. Do you see the picture here? They're carrying him to the cemetery. He's dead. She has no hope and no future. And this stranger gets even stranger and grabs on to the dead body's carrier. And then gets stranger and says, boy, get up. And the young man gets up and starts to talk. And then Jesus says, son, young guy, go back to your mama. The crowd that was from both groups. Remember, Jesus is traveling with a large crowd. Now, how big a large crowd is, leave it to your imagination. Okay? And the townspeople are all following this cemetery trip. And that's a large crowd. So you had the convergence of two large crowds. And they were filled with awe. And they praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. See, they didn't know Jesus is the Son of God. They didn't know Jesus was going to die on a cross. They didn't know that Jesus was going to raise from the dead. But they'd heard stories of the prophets. And how the prophets had stretched themselves out on dead people and they came to life. How prophets had done miracles in God's name. And they equated this man, this stranger, to the best that they knew. And they said, God has come to help his people. Boy, they were truthful, weren't they? Not knowing who Jesus was, they were pretty accurate, weren't they? This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the whole surrounding countryside. What do you think the mom felt? What do you think? Can you even imagine what it must feel like? I think you can. Not just you mothers, I think you fathers. And I think you non-parents can feel it too, because you know what it is? It's the same feeling as when you've been walking, and I'm gonna say this, please don't get me on trademark, because Jesus talked about this long before the TV producers did. Okay? This is way before The Walking Dead became the TV show The Walking Dead. We, as sinners, have been walking dead. Remember what it was like when you first accepted Jesus? Can your mind go back that far? See, I have a hard time. I'll be honest with you. I am 60 years old. I accepted Jesus at 8 years old. And I really can't tell you what it felt like. I don't remember, other than I can tell you where it was. I can't tell you exactly when. I can tell you who the teacher was. Bob Kostick. He was a local mailman. And he taught about how if you don't love Jesus and if you haven't asked him to take away your sin, you don't get into heaven. You have to go to the other place called hell. And after he did that, he gave an altar call. And it was in the basement of the church, because it was children's church. How many of you remember when we had children's churches? And it was a little miniature altar, kind of looked like this one, but a lot lower, a lot narrower, base for kids. And it was like 2 spots in from the end. In the basement of the church, that altar is gone. The basement's still there. Every so often I used to walk through that basement. My mom was the organist, so I could get it on off days and just go down to that spot and go, I can take you there today, I think. I don't know if they remodeled. What would be the best Mother's Day gift that somebody could be given? If their child who was dead was brought back to life. Or their child who was spiritually dead was brought back to life. See, in a little bit we're going to be done. And I'm going to tell you, for those of you who are watching us online, in our church, we give all the mothers, all the women, just a little token that we love them. We give a flower. And that's nice. Some of you are going to go out to dinner. That's nice. Some of you got candy. I know that my wife got a phone call at 6:30 this morning from our son. She doesn't get up early on Sunday mornings. That's her only day off. And, hello. Hi, Mom. What's up? See, he's out in another state, and he works hard, and he's in a job that can be dangerous. And her first motherly thought is, "What's wrong?" Nothing, Mom. Just want to say Happy Mother's Day. Do you know what time it is? That's what my wife said. Do you know what time it is? Yeah, Mom, I got to get to work. Oh, okay. But at the same time, even though he woke her, even though her eyes weren't quite open, even though her mind wasn't geared up for the day, it blessed her heart. What I'm going to tell you is no matter where you're at personally, you can be in the midst of the worst thing you think you've ever dealt with, and Jesus says, I'm here. Jesus says, I feel it. Jesus says, I understand it. And I'm going to go one step further. If death isn't a hindrance to Jesus, can't he handle what you're going up against today? This mother had the happiest Mother's Day of her life. Think about it for a minute. She's taking her son to be buried, and Jesus hands her son back. A woman who'd been a mother and was no longer a mother has been restored to her motherhood with all its gifts. Jesus is a Jesus and God of restoration. Let's pray. Dear Lord, during this time where there's so many hurting people with the pandemic, with the job losses, with the closures, Lord, would you reach down to us and touch our coffin? Lord, whether it's a coffin of health or a coffin of relationship or a coffin of situation, Lord, would you reach down, touch, restore, and love? Lord, you gave her the best Mother's Day possible.